Every year, Morgan Stanley ranks all of the Swiss watch manufacturers. Today, we're going to take a look at the top 50 Swiss watchmakers, and you will be surprised by some of the rankings. We're going to start with number 50 on the list. We're going to go through the list pretty quickly until we get to number 10, and then we'll slow it down a little bit. But we're going to start with the 50th, and that is Greubel Forsey. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the numbers here as well. Currently, Greubel Forsey has a 0% market share. There are a lot of watches on this list that have 0% market share. However, they only make 255 watches a year. So very low number of watches coming out of Greubel Forsey. Next on this list is Bell & Ross. By the way, I'll be looking down at a piece of paper because all of this information is on the piece of paper in front of me. I'll also put up some imagery so you could see some of these numbers as well. Bell & Ross made 13,600 watches last year, and they have 0% market share. So essentially all that means is that they have less than 1% market share. They don't actually have 0%, they have less than 1%. However, I do want to mention these brands. La Chute Originale, they made 16,000 watches, actually a lot less than I thought that they produced. Again, 0% market share. Dior is next with 6,000 watches produced. They have a 0% market share. Parmigiani with almost 3,000 watches or 3,000 watches produced, 0% market share. Again, that means they were just below 1% or somewhere below 1%, and that's why it shows up as 0%. Roger Dubuis, very surprising, they make 6,600 watches last year, so this is in 2023, and they had 0% market share or less than 1%. Frederic Constant made 63,000 watches, and they have less than 1% market share. Same thing goes for Oris. 52,000 watches produced, and they only have 0% market share, so less than 1% market share. Bois Mercier, now we are up to number 42 on this list. Bois Mercier made a lot of watches, 90,000 watches, which seems like a lot of watches, but we'll get to the numbers, the big numbers later on in this list. And then again, you have 0% market share. Ulysse Nardin, this was actually pretty surprising as well. Only 7,000 watches made, and again, less than 1% of the market share. However, I know that they sell a lot of parts to other watch brands, and they are a big manufacturer, so I'm not sure that actually factors into this. I think they're only factoring in watches sold, so that's why they have such a small market share and a small number of watches actually sold. GP, Gerard Perregaux, we're talking about 9,500 units sold, again, below 1% market share. And then we get into bigger numbers. This is Certina. Now, this is part of the Swatch Group. They make a lot of watches that are mostly popular in Europe. However, they are sold here in the United States at very few locations. They made 155,000 units with less than 1% market share. Again, these are less expensive watches, so that kind of makes sense. Compare that to GP, who only made 9,500 watches. However, they make more expensive watches, so it kind of makes sense. H. Moser & Cie, actually just recently visited Moserland. I've done a couple of videos with them. They made only 3,500 watches last year, and again, less than 1% of market share. Next brand on here is FP Journe. We're up to number 37 on this list. FP Journe, a very popular brand. However, they are very, very scarce. They only made 1,800 watches, and again, less than 1% of the market share. That is pretty impressive. They are very rare watches. Harry Winston, 8,500 watches. Again, less than 1% market share. Very surprised in that as well, because they make very expensive watches. I thought they might be a little bit higher in the ranking, or at least in the number of watches that they produce, but there you go. Gucci, really high here. Really surprised by this number. 238,000 watches, and again, less than 1% of the market share. So we have not even broken that 1% yet. We're getting there. We're almost there. We're at Gucci. We're going to Zenith. Zenith made 12,000 watches, and they have less than 1% market share. Jacob & Co., a brand that I absolutely hate, they made 2,750 watches. All of those, I wish they never made them. I don't like the company, but that is just my personal opinion. 0% market share, well, less than 1% market share. I wish it was even less than that. Louis Vuitton, 35,000 watches. That is actually pretty high. I know they've recently revamped things, but I'm not sure if they're going to be going to more expensive watches. They already are pretty expensive, but I believe that they are going to even more expensive watches. They're trying to go into haute horology and make less watches and sell them for more money. So this number might change next year. Again, 0% market share or less than 1% market share. Mito, this is the last watch on this list that has less than 1% market share. They made 123,000 watches. They're also owned by the Swatch Group. Now we're going to see a little bit of a trend here. Hamilton, also owned by the Swatch Group. They made 138,000 watches, and they have 1% market share. So it could be above 1%, but it's coming in at 1% on this list. Above that is Montblanc. They made less watches, 75,000 watches. However, they also have 1% of the market share. Breguet, 1% of the market share. They only made 20,000 watches, so a pretty low number when you're considering how popular Breguet is, and Breguet is a pretty popular brand. Above that though is Rado, and again, both of those brands are within the Swatch Group. Rado also within the Swatch Group, and they made 172,000 watches, again, 1% of market share. Frank Mueller, this is a very big surprise. 21,000 watches. I am surprised they are making that many watches. I'm not sure who's actually buying them, and I'm not trying to insult anybody who wears Frank Mueller. I've just never actually seen anybody wearing one, and it's kind of crazy that they are this high on the list. So they are at number 26, or basically at the midpoint of this list. 21,000, and again, 1% of market share. A. Lange & Söhne, we're talking about 6,000 watches, not a lot of watches here, 1% of market share. Piaget, another brand owned by the Richemont Group, along with A. Lange & Söhne, they made 19,000 watches, and again, 1% of market share. Blancpain, this is a little bit surprising, only 28,000 watches, and they are at 1% of market share. Again, they are owned by the Swatch Group. Chanel made 75,000 watches last year, 1% of market share. If you had told me they made more watches than Blancpain, I would have probably argued with you, but here it is. Here are the numbers. Kind of crazy. They made 75,000 watches. Van Cleef & Arpels, 13,500 watches. Again, I'm kind of surprised by that because I'm surprised they make that many watches. And again, 1% of market share. Chopard, 42,000 watches, 1% of market share. Chopard really have kicked it up a notch over the past few years. I'm not sure where they were ranked previously, but that seems kind of interesting. Bulgari, again, another jewelry brand. They had 58,000 watches produced last year, 1% of market share. We're up to number 18, and we're up to Panerai. I'm actually very surprised Panerai this low on the list, 67,000 watches produced. That seems like a very high number for them. I'm not sure why, but it does seem like a very high number, and only 1% of market share. So this is probably higher, probably closer to 2%. However, this is at 1% on this list. The next watch on this list, probably the biggest surprise for me, is Tudor. I thought Tudor would have way more market share than it does. They only have 2% of the market, which is not a lot when you're considering how popular Tudor are. 255,000 watches produced. So far on this entire list, they are the highest. So 255,000 watches. However, the next brand is even more surprising because they fall in above Tudor, and it is Hermes. Hermes produced 79,000 watches, and they only have 1% market share. So going forward now, everything is above 1 or 2% market share. So the next watch on this list is Tag Heuer. Not surprising that they make a lot of watches, 390,000 watches and 2% of market share. JLC producing 97,000 watches. Again, a little bit surprising, 2% of market share. This is the biggest on the list. This is the biggest producer of watches here on this list. This list, again, produced by Morgan Stanley. This is Swatch, not the Swatch Group, however, Swatch. And I think this has to do with the fact of all of the releases that they've been doing, all the collaboration watches, the Omega Moon Swatch, and of course the Blancpain 50 Fathoms collaboration that they did last year. So they are selling a lot of watches, 5,800,000 watches. They only have 2% of the market though. That's because all of their watches are very, very affordable. So that kind of makes sense. They are number 13 on this list. Number 12 on this list, a brand that is very, very hated by a lot of people. However, they make a lot less watches than I thought they did. 52,000 watches, and that is Hublot. And they have a very small portion of the market, 2%. So very small portion, and I'm not surprised by that. IWC next on this list. We're at number 11, 137,000. And again, they only have 2% of the market share. So now we're getting into the top 10. And at number 10, something that kind of surprised me, it is a watch brand that I absolutely love. It's Tissot. They sold 3,100,000 watches last year. And that makes a lot of sense with the popularity of the PRX and all the other watches that they've been producing. That makes a lot of sense. However, they only have 3% of market share. So 3%. And they made 3,100,000 watches. Obviously, their watches are on the more affordable side. Next on this list, number 9 is Breitling, with producing 178,000 watches, only 2% of market share. Breitling, extremely popular, and it makes a lot of sense. I'm not sure why they actually only have 3% or 2% of the market share. I would figure they had more, but there you go. Next on the list is one of my favorite brands of all time. It is Vacheron, and they only produced 35,000 watches, which kind of makes sense because they don't produce a ton of watches. So they are pretty rare, and they have 3% of the market share. So Vacheron producing a very low number of watches, obviously way more expensive than basically many of the brands that we were talking about before. So it kind of makes sense that their market share is just around 3%. So Vacheron is at 8. At number 7, Longines. Longines made 1,600,000 watches, and they have 3% of the market share. This makes a lot of sense to me. A lot of the watches that they're coming out with are amazing, and they are doing an incredible job. Again, owned by the Swatch Group, so is Tissot, IWC, and of course Vacheron, owned by Richemont, and then there's LVMH peppered throughout this as well. Next on the list is a brand that I don't really love also, and I think a lot of people do. However, they only made 5,600 watches. It is Richard Mille. They made 5,600 watches. They have 3% of the market share. And that makes a lot of sense because their watches are very, very expensive. So they don't need to sell as many watches to get as much market share as a brand like Vacheron or Longines. So that makes a lot of sense. And they are at 3%. Now we are going to 6%. And we're going to be talking about Haute Horology again, Patek Philippe. Patek Philippe produced 70,000 watches. Kind of surprising, but it is 70,000 and they have 6% of the market share. Next is AP, so Audemars Piguet. They get 51,000 watches, or made 51,000 watches, and they have 5% of the market share. Now, the next three should not be surprising. There are some names that I have not mentioned yet. Obviously, Rolex, Cartier, and Omega being those three. Comment down below which ones you think are in which order. I think it's pretty obvious what the order is, but it may not be obvious to everyone. We're going to start with number 3. So coming in at number 3 is Omega. They made 570,000 watches, less than I thought that they would make in a year. That is pretty surprising. And they have 7% of the market share. If you are doing the math, there is a lot left on the table. There is 38% left on the table right now. And actually, if you were doing the math with all those zeros, you probably couldn't do the math, but there's still 38% left on the table. Cartier coming in at number 2. They made 660,000 watches last year, more than Omega, which is kind of surprising to me, at least, and they get 8% of the market share. Cartier has been on fire recently, and I think at the top of a lot of collectors' lists. It kind of makes sense. There are some pretty great watches that they're making, but they're also churning them out. 660,000 watches. And of course, number 1 on this list, the top Swiss manufacturers of watches in 2023 by not only market share, but number of watches produced, Rolex. Rolex produced 1,240,000 watches, by far the most out of one of the major manufacturers that are producing very high-end watches, unless you're looking at Longines, which produced around 1.6 million. However, their watches are less expensive. They have a 30% market share, literally crushing every other brand out there. 30% of the market belongs to Rolex. It makes a lot of sense. They are making a ton of watches, but they're also selling a ton of watches, and obviously it speaks for itself. 1.24 million watches produced with a 30% market share. So Rolex is still king. A lot of surprises in this list. I think one of the biggest surprises for me was Tudor's position in this list, and a few other brands that I didn't even realize people were still buying, like Frank Mueller. That's just me. I don't know. Maybe I'm crazy. But tell me what you think of this list. Were you right about the top 3, Rolex, Cartier, and Omega? Tell me what you think about the market in general. I want to hear what you guys have to say about this list. I will leave this list down in the description below. So if you want to see the full list and those numbers, I'll see if I can actually paste this down there below. If not, I'll post this on Instagram or on my community page here on YouTube so you could take a look. Anyway, guys, thank you for logging on. I hope you found this interesting or helpful in some way. If you did, don't forget to like, subscribe, hit that bell icon. It's super helpful for the channel, and I very much appreciate it. Anyway, guys, thank you for logging on. I'll catch you guys in the next video.